The divorce papers were already on the table when Kang Min-jae's driver pulled the Maybach to a stop outside the estate gates. He didn't know that yet. He was still thinking about the woman he had seen standing under a bookstore awning 30 minutes earlier. His wife, Nia Brooks, laughing like she hadn't laughed in years. Not the careful, constructed smile she wore beside him at charity dinners. Something rawer. Something that reached her eyes and stayed there. The man who put it there was nobody. A teacher in a wool coat holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Min-jae had crushed men who threatened his shipping routes. He had sat across negotiating tables from people who wanted him dead and eaten his food calmly while they made their threats. He had never once, in 40 years of living, felt afraid of a man in a wool coat holding coffee. He felt it now. If you have ever watched someone you love smile at a stranger the way they used to smile at you, you already know what that fear feels like. You don't need anyone to explain it, and if you haven't, keep watching, because this story will. Before we go further, if stories about love, pride, silence, and what we lose when we stop paying attention are the kind of stories that stay with you, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. I release new stories every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like if this already has you thinking. And tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Seoul. Let's go back to that rainy evening. Let's go back to the moment everything began to crack. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon. Seoul in October had a particular kind of gray to it. Not violent, not dramatic, just persistent. The kind of weather that made you feel like the city had quietly decided to turn inward. Streets emptied earlier than usual. Restaurants filled up. The neon signs along Gangnam's main corridor bled their colors into the wet pavement and made everything look slightly underwater. Min-jae had not eaten since 6 that morning. He hadn't noticed until his driver, a compact and careful man named Seo, who had worked for him 11 years, glanced in the rearview mirror and asked if he wanted to stop somewhere. "No," Min-jae said. He was looking at his phone. Numbers. A shipping manifest out of Busan that his logistics director had forwarded with 3 flagged line items. A contract renewal for a warehouse property in Incheon that needed his signature by tomorrow morning. A text from his second-in-command, Park Jun, that read, "The Daejeon situation is handled. Confirm when you're available." He typed back, "Tomorrow." 9. This was a Tuesday. He had been in meetings since 7:30 in the morning. The last one had ended 20 minutes ago in a private dining room at a hotel in Gangnam, where 4 men in expensive suits had sat across from him and pretended they had leverage they didn't have. Min-jae had let them believe it for 40 minutes before quietly demonstrating otherwise. Not with threats. He hadn't needed threats in years. He simply laid out what he knew about each of them, one fact at a time, the way a man empties his pockets at a customs counter. Methodically, without expression. The meeting ended early. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore. It was a deeper exhaustion, the kind that settled in the bones after years of operating at a constant state of controlled tension. Even inside the Maybach, even with the rain drumming softly against the reinforced windows and Seo navigating the wet streets without being asked for directions, Min-jae's shoulders held their position. Jaw set. Hands quiet in his lap, but not relaxed. He had not fully relaxed in years. He wasn't sure he remembered how. They were 3 blocks from the estate when Seo slowed for a red light at an intersection near a stretch of independent storefronts. Min-jae wasn't looking out the window. He was still on his phone, scrolling back through the flagged shipping manifest, when something in his peripheral vision pulled his attention sideways. He didn't know why. He couldn't have explained it even afterward. Some part of his brain registered movement or color or something specific to that figure standing under the green canvas awning of a small bookstore, and his eyes moved before his mind gave the instruction. He saw Nia. She was wearing the dark blue coat he had bought her the previous winter. She had her natural hair pulled back, though a few strands had come loose from the rain. She was holding nothing. Both her hands were free at her sides, which meant she'd already put away her umbrella, which meant she was comfortable enough where she was standing that she wasn't concerned about the weather. She was laughing. Min-jae had known Nia Brooks for 6 years. He had been married to her for 4 of them. In that time, he had seen her smile at children. He had seen her smile at his mother before his mother passed. He had seen her smile politely at government officials and charity organizers and the wives of his business associates. That careful professional warmth she'd mastered, the one that gave nothing away. He had seen her genuinely happy too, early in their marriage, when things were different, when he'd still made time for things to be different. But the laugh he was watching now was something else entirely. It wasn't polished. It wasn't restrained. Her head had tilted slightly and her whole face was in it, and she reached out and briefly touched the forearm of the man standing across from her. Not romantically, just the instinctive physical punctuation of someone lost in genuine amusement. The man was African American, roughly Nia's age, wearing a simple gray wool coat that had seen better seasons. He was holding 2 paper cups from what looked like the coffee shop next door. He was laughing too, but softer, watching her face more than he was laughing himself. The way people do when someone else's joy is the thing they actually came for. The light turned green. Seo didn't move the car immediately. He'd noticed Min-jae's stillness in the rear-view mirror. "Sir, drive," Min-jae said. His voice came out even. It always came out even. That was something he'd spent a lifetime building. A face and a voice that gave nothing away, that could absorb anything and return it as calm. It had served him in every room he'd ever entered. It served him now. But his left hand, resting against his thigh, had closed into a loose fist without him deciding to close it. Seo drove. Min-jae did not look back. The estate sat on a hillside in a quiet residential area north of the city center, behind gates and cameras, and a perimeter that 3 different private security firms had evaluated and certified. The house itself was a study in controlled elegance, clean architectural lines, imported stone, curated art. His interior designer had selected 5 years ago and which he had never quite looked at. He'd approved the designs from photographs. He hadn't walked through the finished space with anyone. He walked through it alone most nights. Nia's things were still here. Her books stacked on the reading chair in the second sitting room. Her handwriting on the notes she left herself on the kitchen island. The scarf she'd worn 2 days ago still draped over the back of one of the dining chairs. Evidence of a life still being lived inside these walls, but not with him, not in any way that connected. He went to his office. He stood at the window for a while with the lights off, looking at the rain moving across the garden below. The garden that a landscaping crew maintained and that no one used. There was a stone bench down there that had been there when he purchased the property. He had never sat on it. He wondered if Nia had. He thought about the way she had touched that man's arm, the thoughtlessness of it. Not planned, not considered, just the natural movement of a woman comfortable enough in a moment to let her hands be honest. He tried to remember the last time Nia had touched him like that, casually, without occasion. He couldn't place it. He wasn't angry at her. That surprised him. He had expected to sit with this feeling and find rage underneath it somewhere, the hot defensive anger of a man whose territory had been crossed. Instead, there was something quieter and considerably worse. He felt like he was looking at evidence of something he had already known, but had been very carefully not looking at. He opened his desk drawer and took out the bottle of scotch he kept there for meetings he didn't want to host at a table. He poured 2 fingers. He didn't drink it. He just held the glass and looked at the rain. His phone buzzed. Park June again. Something about a contact in Incheon. He set the phone face down on the desk without reading it. For 11 years, he had run an organization that operated across 4 industries in 6 cities. He had done it by being, above everything else, attentive. He noticed what other people missed. He read rooms and people in shifting situations with an accuracy that his rivals had described, in terms not meant as compliments, as unnatural. He had built everything he had on the principle that the man who pays closest attention wins. It had not occurred to him until this specific Tuesday evening in October to pay that same attention to his own home. He told himself he was not going to look into the man. He told himself this 3 times over the next 48 hours, the way a man tells himself he's not going to check his phone after midnight, decisively, and then again when the first decision doesn't hold. He lasted 2 days. On Thursday morning, he called a man named Byun, who handled sensitive inquiries for him and said, very specifically, that he wanted basic information on a volunteer associated with the Multicultural Literacy Center in Mapo District. African-American man, approximately mid-30s, wool coat, frequent presence. No deeper inquiry than a name, professional background, and connection to the literacy center. Byun called back in 3 hours. Malcolm Reed, 37 years old, born in Atlanta, Georgia, moved to Seoul 4 years ago on an educational visa, subsequently renewed. Primary occupation, freelance English language instructor, contract work with several international schools in the city. Secondary, volunteer literacy coach at the same center 3 days per week, a commitment he had held for 2.5 years. No criminal record, no civil litigation, no financial irregularities. Rented a 2-room apartment in Mapo, drove a second-hand vehicle, held a modest bank balance, consistent with his income profile. Nothing, no leverage, no darkness, nothing to work with. Min-jae sat with that file for a long time. In his experience, everyone had something. He had never met a person without a pressure point somewhere, a debt, a history, a relationship that could be strained, something that could be found and used if needed. It wasn't that he went looking for these things habitually. It was just that in his world, knowing they existed was basic preparation. Malcolm Reed did not appear to have anything. He was, as far as Bion's inquiry could determine, exactly what he looked like. A man who taught children to read and drank coffee and made Nia laugh. Min-jae closed the file. He picked up his phone and called the man overseeing his Busan shipping operation, and for the next 4 hours he worked. He was precise and efficient, and he did not think about Nia or Malcolm or the bookstore awning or the way a woman could laugh at a stranger the way she'd forgotten to laugh at her husband. He worked until 9 that night. He came home to a dark house. Nia's car was in the garage, so she was home, but the lights in the common areas were off, and the kitchen was untouched, which meant she had eaten earlier or hadn't eaten, and either way had not been waiting for him. He stood in the entrance hall for a moment after Seo pulled the car out. The house smelled like nothing, neutral, climate-controlled air, clean surfaces, and the faint trace of whatever Nia's shampoo left in a space after she'd moved through it. There had been a time when he came home to a lit kitchen and something on the stove and Nia sitting at the island with a book, and she'd look up and say something like, "You look terrible, sit down." And it had been the best part of his day even when he didn't admit it. He couldn't remember when that had stopped. He tried to trace it backward and couldn't find a clean line. No fight, no specific incident, just a gradual recession, like a tide going out so slowly you don't notice the waterline dropping until one day you realize the beach is completely dry. He went upstairs without eating. He passed the door to the room Nia used as a reading space and saw the light under the door. He stopped. He stood in the hallway with his hand at his side and thought about knocking. He considered what he would say. He could not find an opening that didn't sound like it was about what he'd seen through the Maybach window, and he didn't want it to be about that. He didn't know what he wanted it to be about. He walked past the door to his own room. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and untied his shoes and set them aside and lay back on top of the covers, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. He thought, "She has been saying goodbye for a long time." He thought, "I have not been paying attention." He thought, "I don't know how to fix something I don't fully understand yet." He did not sleep well. The following week he did something that no one on his staff anticipated, and several of them found deeply unsettling. He told his assistant, a capable and unflappable woman named Ji-hae, to clear 2 hours from his schedule every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, beginning the following week. Ji-hae paused. She had managed his calendar for 6 years and had never once encountered a request she needed to pause before responding to. 2 hours, she said. "Yes. For personal," he said, and returned to the document he'd been reading. Ji-hae cleared the time. Min-jae drove himself to Mapo District on a Tuesday afternoon. He parked half a block from the literacy center and sat in his car. He did not go inside. He was not ready to go inside. He told himself he wanted to understand what this place was before he made any decisions. He watched people arrive, mostly women, a few men, some of them clearly immigrants navigating the city in languages that were still new to them. Children running ahead of parents. An older man carrying a folded umbrella even though it wasn't raining. He watched Malcolm Reed arrive at 12:40 on a bicycle, lock it to a post, pull a messenger bag over his shoulder, and walk through the front door talking to a small girl who had run up alongside him, her backpack bouncing, telling him something that made him lean down to hear better. Min-jae watched him listen to a child the way people listen to other adults. He sat in his car for the full 2 hours. He drove home. He told Ji-hae to keep the Tuesday and Thursday blocks clear. He came back Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and he wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly. I was a man who believed in gathering complete information before making a move, but he had the uncomfortable awareness that what he was gathering here wasn't intelligence. It was something closer to evidence against himself. The fourth time he came, he saw Nia arrive. She walked from the direction of the bus stop, which meant she hadn't taken her car. She was carrying a fabric tote that looked heavy, and she was already smiling before she reached the door at a woman who was coming out just as Nia was going in, and they stopped and talked for a moment on the steps. Min-jae sat in his car and watched his wife on the steps of a literacy center in Mapo district and felt something collapse quietly inside his chest. She looked like herself, a version of herself he recognized but could not account for having lost access to. She looked free. He drove home and sat in his office and did not turn on any lights, and did not pour any scotch, and did not call anyone. He opened his desk drawer and took out his own personal notebook, the one he kept for thoughts too provisional to say aloud, and he wrote one sentence. He looked at it for a long time. He closed the notebook without adding anything, but the sentence stayed with him. It sat behind everything for the rest of that week and into the next, behind every meeting and every call and every decision he made at his desk. I built her a cage and called it protection. He tore the page out of the notebook, not carefully. He gripped the corner and pulled, and the paper came out uneven, leaving a ragged edge along the binding. He looked at the torn sheet for a moment, that single sentence in his own handwriting, and then he folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket instead of throwing it away. He wasn't sure why. He sat at his desk until past midnight. The rest of the house was silent in the particular way that large, expensive, mostly empty houses go silent. Not peaceful, just absent. He could hear the ventilation system. He could hear very faintly rain returning against the windows. He could not hear Nia. She had come home while he was in his office. He'd heard the front door and the particular sound of her setting her keys on the entry table, a sound so specific to her that he would have recognized it through walls. He had not come out. She had not knocked. They had lived like this for longer than he wanted to calculate. He poured scotch this time and drank half of it and left the rest. Ji-hee appeared in his office doorway at 8:15 the following morning with the kind of expression she used when the information she was carrying was not what he was going to want. Park Jun is asking to be moved from 9 to 8, she said. He says it's regarding Incheon. Leave it at 9. He also says it's time sensitive. Everything Park Jun considers time-sensitive has a 48-hour window that he refuses to acknowledge. Min-jae did not look up from the document he was reading. 9 o'clock. Ji-hee left without further comment. Park Jun arrived at 9, looking like a man who had been awake since 5. He was 42, lean, with a close-cropped beard he'd grown in the past year that Min-jae still hadn't adjusted to. He'd been with the organization for 16 years, which made him the longest-serving person in Min-jae's immediate circle, and he had the specific confidence of someone who had survived long enough to believe he understood his employer. He dropped a folder on the desk. "The Incheon warehouse lease," he said. "Choi is backing out." Min-jae opened the folder. "Since when?" "His lawyer contacted us yesterday afternoon. He's citing a clause in the preliminary agreement about regulatory compliance review. It's a manufactured exit. The clause is vague enough that his lawyer could argue it in 3 different directions." Park Jun sat down without being invited to, which he did sometimes and which Min-jae permitted because correcting it cost more energy than it was worth. He got a better offer. "From who?" "I'm working on that. My best guess is the Suwon Group." Min-jae turned a page, read, turned another. "Pull the letter of intent we filed with the Port Authority in February. If Choi's name appears anywhere in the preliminary framework as a condition for our operational license, his exit creates a gap we can use." Park Jun wrote something in his phone. "And if it doesn't? Then we find a different warehouse and charge Choi the administrative cost of wasting our time through whatever arrangement we formalize with whoever replaces him." Min-jae closed the folder and set it aside. "What else?" Park Jun hesitated, which was unusual. Min-jae looked up. "One of my people flagged something," Park Jun said, "about the Tuesday and Thursday blocks on your calendar." The room changed temperature in a way that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. "Your people," Min-jae said. "I asked Ji-hee about a scheduling conflict last week, and she mentioned the recurring blocks. I didn't ask her to explain them." He paused. "I did some checking on my own." Min-jae set his pen down on the desk. He set it down very carefully, which anyone who knew him would have recognized as a more significant signal than if he'd thrown it. "You checked," Min-jae said. "I had someone confirm your location on Tuesday afternoon." Park Jun kept his voice level, but there was a tightness around his eyes. "A literacy center in Mapo. You sat in your car for 2 hours." "I'm aware of where I was. You were sitting outside a building where your wife volunteers, alone, in an unmarked vehicle." He leaned forward slightly. "I need to understand what's happening." "What's happening," Min-jae said quietly, "is that you had someone follow me." "I had someone confirm." "Don't reorganize the sentence. You had someone follow me." Min-jae stood up. He did it slowly, which was worse than if he'd done it quickly. "In 16 years, has there been a single moment where that was an appropriate decision for you to make?" Park Jun held his ground physically, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You've been distracted for 3 weeks. You pushed the Daejeon confirmation by 2 days. You left the Choi negotiation to secondary channels when you would normally have handled that personally. And now you're sitting outside buildings alone in an unmarked car, watching a woman who is—" He stopped. "Finish the sentence." Silence. "Finish it, Jun." Park Jun exhaled through his nose. "There are people who would pay significant money to know your patterns. If you're compromised, I am not compromised. How would I know that if you won't tell me what you're doing?" Min-jae came around the desk. Not fast. He moved the way he always moved in these moments, with a deliberateness that made the space around him feel smaller. He stopped 3 feet from Park Jun. "My wife," he said. Park Jun waited. "I was watching my wife." He held the other man's gaze. "Because she volunteers at that center twice a week, and I did not know that. Because she has been doing it for 2 years, and I did not know that either. Because I could tell you the shipping manifest for every vessel we moved through Busan in the last 6 months, and I could not have told you, 3 weeks ago, how my wife spends her Tuesday afternoons." He paused. "That is what is happening." Park Jun was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" "That's it." Another pause. Something shifted in Park Jun's expression. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated. He'd been with Min-jae long enough to understand that the most dangerous situations were not the ones that looked threatening on the surface. He looked at his employer standing 3 feet away and understood, possibly for the first time, that the man in front of him was not troubled by a business problem. "I shouldn't have had you followed," Park Jun said. "No. It won't happen again." "I know." Min-jae walked back around the desk and sat down and picked up his pen. "The Incheon file. I want the Port Authority letter by this afternoon." Park Jun picked up his folder and stood. At the door he paused. "For what it's worth." "It's worth nothing right now," Min-jae said, not unkindly. "Close the door." The door closed. Min-jae sat still at his desk for a long time. Then he opened the center drawer and touched the folded paper in his jacket pocket without taking it out. He had 16 people who would die for him if the order came down correctly. He had infrastructure across 4 cities, relationships with officials in 2 government ministries, and enough documented leverage on enough powerful figures to make himself effectively untouchable for the foreseeable future. His wife had been building a life 2 districts away on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for 2 years, and he had not known. He pulled out his phone and opened Nia's contact. Her photo was one he'd taken himself 3 years ago, somewhere on a trip he could picture vaguely. Somewhere coastal. She was laughing at something off camera, not at him. He remembered being frustrated that she wouldn't look directly at the lens. He put the phone face down. He picked up the Incheon file. He did not tell Nia what he'd seen. Not that week, not the week after. What he did instead was begin paying attention in the particular way that his years of training had made automatic, without announcing it, without changing the surface of things, just beginning to observe. He noticed things he had not noticed before because he had not been looking. She left the house at 9 on Tuesday mornings, dressed practically. Not the clothes she wore to foundation events or the careful put-together look she assembled for appearances beside him. Jeans, good walking shoes, whatever coat the weather required. She came back in the early afternoon, and on those days she moved differently through the house. Lighter, somehow. Like something had been temporarily resolved. She read in the evenings. She had always read. But he noticed now that she had 2 books going at the same time, one in English and one in Korean, and based on the bookmarks, she was moving through both simultaneously. She cooked for herself on the night she knew he wouldn't be home, and she cooked simply. Not the elaborate meals she'd once made for both of them, just what she wanted. He found evidence of this in the kitchen without looking for it. A bowl rinsed in the sink, a spice jar left on the counter, once a half-finished glass of red wine that she'd apparently abandoned when she moved to the reading room. He left it where it was. He started coming home earlier. Not dramatically, not with announcement. He shifted 2 meetings from evening slots to morning. He stopped taking calls at dinner. He had been eating alone in his office most nights. Now he ate at the dining table, even when Nia wasn't there, as a kind of preparation. Getting used to the idea of a different kind of evening, Nia noticed. He could tell because she began leaving the kitchen a few minutes later than usual on the nights he came home early. A small adjustment that suggested she was aware of his presence and hadn't decided yet what to do with it. The first time they ate at the same table in what he estimated was 6 weeks, neither of them planned it. He came home at 7 to find her just sitting down with her own plate, and he set his briefcase down and asked, without particular pressure, if she'd mind if he joined her. She looked at him for a moment. "It's your table," she said, which was not the same as yes, but was not no. He got his own food and sat across from her and they ate. She had put on music from somewhere, something low and understated, jazz or adjacent to it. He didn't ask about it. She didn't explain it. They ate in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was at least honest. "How was your day?" she said eventually. It was a test. He knew it was a test not because she was being hostile, but because it was the most basic possible question, and she had not asked it in a long time, and the way she asked it now had a quality of listening in it that he wasn't sure he deserved. "Long," he said. "We had a contract situation in Incheon that turned sideways." He paused. "It's handled now." She nodded. Went back to her food. "Yours?" he asked. Something almost moved across her face. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. "I helped a 9-year-old read her first full chapter of a book today. She cried." She looked back at her plate. "The good kind." He set his fork down and looked at her. "Where do you do that?" She glanced up. "What?" "The tutoring, the reading." He kept his voice careful. "I don't think I ever asked you which organization." The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. Nia put her fork down. She looked at him across the table with an expression he didn't know how to categorize. Not anger, not warmth, something that sat in between those things, and was harder to read than either. "The Multicultural Literacy Center in Mapo," she said. "I've been going twice a week for 2 years." "I didn't know that," he said. "I know you didn't." No accusation in her voice. That was almost worse. Plain statement of fact delivered without inflection, which meant she was past the point where the absence of his attention made her angry. She had simply accommodated it, filed it in the category of things that were true about her life that Min-jae Kang did not know. He picked up his fork. They finished the meal. But something had shifted between them, some barely visible degree. Not better, not worse. Just different. Like 2 people who had been standing back to back and one of them had turned around, no closer, but at least now facing the same direction. 3 days later, she came home from the center and he was in the kitchen. Not cooking. He couldn't cook in any real sense, and he'd never pretended otherwise. He had found a jar of the instant coffee she kept in the cabinet for mornings she was running late, and he was making 2 cups because the act of making one felt worse, somehow, than making 2 and having her decline. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, still in her coat, tote bag over one shoulder, and she looked at him standing there with 2 mugs and the expression on his face that he knew was not fully under control right now. "I didn't know when you'd be back," he said. "I can put one away." She came into the kitchen, set her bag on the counter. "Don't put it away." She sat at the island. He put the mug in front of her and sat across. They drank coffee at 9:30 at night in the kitchen of their enormous quiet house and didn't talk for a while, and it was the most normal thing they'd done together in longer than either of them could probably say with accuracy. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired." "Different kind than usual?" She was looking at him with a directness that she hadn't used in a while. Not the careful, managed look she gave him in public. Something more naked than that. "Yes," he said. "Different kind." She wrapped both hands around her mug. Her nails were short, unpainted. She had a small scar on her left thumb from an accident he didn't know the story of, and he was thinking about the fact that he didn't know the story of it, and he'd seen her hands hundreds of times. Min-jae, she said, and stopped. Say it. She looked at the mug. I don't want to fight. I'm not asking you to fight. I'm asking you to say what you were going to say. She was quiet for a moment. I used to plan things. For us. Little things. She still wasn't looking at him. Restaurants I found, weekend ideas, a trip to Jeju that one winter. I stopped planning. She paused. I don't remember when I stopped. I just woke up one day and realized I hadn't planned anything for us in a year, and the strange part was I didn't feel sad about it. I just felt like I'd been accurate. The word landed like something dropped on a stone floor. Or accurate. She hadn't stopped because she gave up. She'd stopped because the data had made the conclusion obvious. I don't know how to say I'm sorry without it sounding like a transaction, he said. She finally looked at him. Then don't say it yet. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the road below, its headlights briefly visible through the window and then gone. Are you happy? He asked. He hadn't planned to ask it. It arrived the way some sentences do, already formed. Nia took a slow breath. Some days, she said. Not here, but some days. He nodded. It was the most honest answer she could have given him, and he received it the same way, without flinching, without defending, because she hadn't thrown it at him. She just told him the truth, and truth, even the kind that opened the floor under you, was something he owed her the dignity of hearing. He drank his coffee. She finished hers. Good night, Min-jae, she said, and picked up her bag and walked to the stairs. He sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. Oh. The envelope was on his desk when he returned from a morning meeting 11 days later. Ji-hae had placed it there with a post-it that said only, delivered by courier this morning, marked personal. Her handwriting was precise and slanted and revealed nothing. It was a standard white envelope, sealed, with his full name written on the front. The handwriting was Nia's. He stood in front of the desk without picking it up for almost a full minute. He knew what it was. He knew it the way the body knows certain things before the mind catches up. A physical certainty that started in his chest and worked outward. He had run an organization built on reading signals correctly. He had never once in 16 years looked at information he didn't want to be accurate and made it accurate by wishing. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. There were 2 documents. One was what he'd expected, legal, formal, structured in the language of dissolution. His name, her name, the date of their marriage, the proposed terms. He read the first page with the flat, controlled attention he brought to contracts and didn't let himself rush. The second document was a single sheet, handwritten. Her handwriting, which was careful and slightly left-leaning. He set the legal pages down and read the letter. She wrote that she had held on for a long time because she believed in him. Not in the empire, not in the man other people were afraid of, but in the man she had met in Chicago 7 years ago, who had sat across from her at a dinner party and asked her 3 questions in a row about her work because he was actually interested. She'd fallen in love with that man. She wanted to be clear about that. She wrote that loneliness inside a marriage was a specific kind of loneliness because it didn't have a name other people could recognize. She had not been abandoned. She had not been mistreated in any obvious way. She had been left behind in a house by a man who was always somewhere else. And she had told herself for years that sacrifice was love and that patience was partnership, and she had eventually had to admit that she'd been wrong about both. She wrote that she didn't hate him, that she had moved beyond the point where this was about anger. She was not leaving because someone else had arrived. She was leaving because she had finally understood that continuing to wait for a life that was never going to begin was not love. It was just waiting. The last line read, "Loving someone cannot replace being loved back." Min-jae put the letter down. He stood very still at his desk with both hands flat on the surface. His jaw was tight. His breathing was controlled. He made it controlled because it was the only thing in the room he had any authority over right now. The letter was sitting on his desk. The legal documents were sitting on his desk. 11 days ago, she had drunk coffee with him in the kitchen and told him some days she was happy, but not here. He had told himself he was paying attention. He had told himself things were shifting. He had permitted himself, very carefully and without acknowledging it, to believe that the small changes he was making were being noticed and were beginning to count. She had written the letter before the coffee. He understood that now. The timeline settled into place with terrible clarity. She had already made the decision. The coffee had not been a test he'd passed or failed. It had been something else, a goodbye that was too honest to be cruel and too sad to be anything other than what it was. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded paper he'd been carrying for 3 weeks. He unfolded it. I built her a cage and called it protection. He stood at his desk reading his own sentence until the words lost their shape, and then he folded the paper again and placed it beside the letter. And he did not call anyone, and he did not pour anything, and he did not move for a very long time. Outside, Seoul continued at its usual pace. He had not stopped anything. He stayed at his desk until the cleaning staff arrived at 7 in the morning. He heard them moving through the lower floor, the quiet efficiency of people trained to work around a presence without acknowledging it. And he stood up from his chair with the specific stiffness of a body that had been still too long, and he walked to the window. Seoul in early morning had a quality he rarely saw because he rarely saw mornings from outside a moving vehicle. The light came in sideways and pale, hitting the upper floors of buildings before it reached the streets, and for a few minutes everything above a certain height was lit and everything below was still in shadow. It looked like the city was waking up in sections. He had not slept. He had not called anyone. The letter and the legal documents were still on his desk. He had not moved them. He had not read the letter again, but he hadn't put it away either, and that was a decision in itself. The particular paralysis of a man who understood that putting the letter in a drawer would mean accepting what it said. He was not there yet. He picked up his phone at 7:15 and called Ji-hye. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had already been awake. "Clear my morning," he said. "Through what time?" "All of it. I'll contact you when I need something." A pause. "Of course." He ended the call and stood at the window for another few minutes, watching the light continue its slow descent toward street level. Then he took his jacket from the back of his chair, put it on, pocketed his phone and his keys, and walked out of the office, past the cleaning crew who stepped aside without making eye contact, through the front entrance and into the gray October morning. He drove himself. He did not go to Mapo. He didn't know where he was going until he was already there, a walking trail along the Han River that he had not been to in years, one of the public paths that ordinary people used on ordinary mornings. He parked at a lot that was barely a quarter full and walked out onto the path and started moving. He was still in yesterday's suit. He became aware of this when a woman walking 2 small dogs gave him a quick assessing look as she passed, the way people looked at someone obviously out of context. He didn't stop. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked and let the cold work on him. The river was flat and gray and enormous at this hour, and the bridges going across it looked provisional at this distance, like things someone had set down temporarily. He walked for 20 minutes without thinking in any directed way. He let things come as they came. The letter. Nia's handwriting. The line about loneliness having no name other people could recognize. He thought about the small wooden box. He stopped walking. He turned around and went back to his car and drove home. The box was on the shelf in the secondary sitting room, the room Nia used for reading. He knew it was there because she had put it there when they moved into the estate, placed it on the middle shelf of the built-in bookcase between a small ceramic figure and a collection of Korean poetry books. He had noted it at the time and not thought about it again. The room smelled like her. Not perfume, something more fundamental, some compound of whatever soap she used and the particular warmth her presence left in a space. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he crossed to the shelf. The box was cedar, palm-sized, with a simple latch. She had given it to him years ago, that first Christmas together, pressed into his hands with the kind of nervous energy she'd had in those early months, before she understood who he was fully and before that knowledge had done whatever it does to people. He had thanked her. He had set it somewhere. He realized now, never opened it. He opened it now. Inside, in the way of someone who assembled meaning carefully, Nia had placed things. 2 paper tickets, creased from folding, for a film he remembered seeing with her in the early weeks of their courtship. He had not been a man who went to movies, and she had told him that was sad in the specific direct way she had about things that other people would soften. And she had bought tickets before he could argue, and he had gone, and he remembered very little about the film itself, but he remembered sitting in the dark next to her and feeling the strangeness of just being somewhere without an agenda. Below the tickets, pressed white lilies. Dry now, flat and translucent against a small square of wax paper, the kind of flowers that had been living things once. He turned the wax paper over and found her handwriting on the back. You brought these on our third date. You said you didn't know what to bring, and lilies seemed serious enough not to be embarrassing. I kept them. He set the wax paper down on the shelf. There were recipes, handwritten on index cards in her careful script, with small notes in the margins. Korean dishes. Dishes he recognized because they were his mother's dishes. He had not told her that. He was certain he had not. And yet she had found them somehow, learned them, written them down with annotations like add ginger. If he's had a hard week and less salt than the original, he won't say anything, but he notices. He stood in the reading room holding index cards with recipes for his dead mother's food that his wife had learned in secret and documented with the care of a woman who was paying attention to a man who was not paying attention to her. He could not feel his hands properly. At the bottom of the box were letters. Not one. Many. A stack of them, folded, unsealed, each one dated. He opened the earliest one, from a date 4 years ago, 6 months into their marriage. She had written to him on a night he could not account for. She wrote that she knew he'd had a difficult meeting and she hadn't asked because she could see the set of his jaw when he came home, and she had learned that he processed things internally first and words second, and she wanted him to know that the house was safe, that she was safe, that he could set things down here if he needed to. She had never given him the letter. He opened another from 2 years later. She wrote about a charity event she'd attended alone because a last-minute situation had pulled him away. She wrote that she had smiled and represented them both and been proud to do it, and that she didn't need him there every time. She understood his world required constant management, but that she had saved him a small piece of the dessert and put it in the refrigerator, and she was not sure he would find it or notice, but she did it anyway. He had not found it. He had not noticed. He opened the last letter. It was dated 6 months ago. The handwriting was steadier than the earlier ones, not more careful, more resolved, like someone who had decided something before she put the pen to paper. She wrote that she had made a decision to stop sending him letters that she never sent. She wrote that she had kept them because she still believed, somewhere below reason, that there would be a night when she would hand him the whole stack and they would read them together and it would be the start of something different. She was writing this last one to acknowledge that she had stopped believing that. Not violently, gradually. The way a room goes dark when the light source is just very slowly dimmed. She wrote, I love you in the way you love a place you used to live. Fully and from a distance, and with the knowledge that you don't live there anymore. Min-jae put the letter down. He sat on the floor of the reading room because his legs made that decision before he did, and he sat with his back against the bookshelf and the open cedar box beside him, and he put both hands over his face, and he stayed like that. He did not cry. He had not cried since his mother's funeral 12 years ago, and he did not cry now, but he held his face in his hands in the empty reading room of his enormous quiet house and understood, completely and with no remaining buffer of self-protection, what he had done. He had not been cruel. He had not been faithless. He had not done any of the things that a man could point to and say, this is where it broke. He had simply been absent, consistently, systematically, in every way that didn't involve physical location, absent. And Nia Brooks had loved him carefully and generously across that absence for 4 years and had filled a cedar box with the evidence of it and had finally, quietly, stopped. He sat on the floor for a long time. Park Jun came to the estate at 2 in the afternoon, not at Min-jae's invitation. He knew because Ji Hae sent a message saying only, PJ is at the gate, says urgent. I told him you weren't available. He said he'd wait. Min-jae was still in his study. He had moved from the reading room, washed his face, changed his jacket, and had been sitting at his desk without working for the past hour. He texted back, send him in. Park Jun came through the door with the energy of a man carrying something he didn't want to carry. He was dressed down, no jacket, just a dark sweater, which meant he'd come from somewhere that wasn't the office. Sit, Min-jae said. I'd rather... Sit, Jun. Park Jun sat. He put both forearms on his knees and looked at Min-jae across the desk, with an expression that Min-jae had seen on him exactly twice before in 16 years. Both times in situations where information was about to change the shape of something irreversibly. Tell me, Min-jae said. Park Jun exhaled. The Suwon group, he said. The ones I told you were behind the Choi situation in Incheon. Yes. They're not Suwon. He pressed his hands together. I have a source in the Port Authority who gave me a thread this morning. I followed it for 3 hours. He paused. It's Byun. The room became very still. Say that again, Min-jae said. Byun, your information man, the one who's been handling sensitive inquiries for you for 9 years. Park Jun's voice was flat and even, and the flatness was the thing that made it land hardest. He's been feeding operational details to an external party for somewhere between 14 and 18 months. The Choi pullout wasn't opportunity, it was arranged. The Incheon warehouse was targeted specifically because it's in the documentation chain for the Busan shipping license. Min-jae had not moved. He had not blinked with any frequency. His hands were flat on the desk, and he was looking at Park Jun with the expression that, in 16 years, Park Jun had learned to fear more than any display of anger. Who is he feeding it to? Min-jae said. I don't have a name. I have a routing structure. Funds moving through 3 shells, originating from a holding company registered in Singapore, with a trail that I can follow further, but not today, not without more access. Park Jun leaned forward. But here's the part that changes things. One of the inquiries Byun ran in the past month, one of his own, not something you authorized, was about your wife. The flat expression on Min-jae's face did not change, not a millimeter. Detail. He ran a location and contact profile on Nia 3 weeks ago. Address of the literacy center, her volunteer schedule, the name of every regular she interacts with there. He stopped. Malcolm Reed's name is in the file. Min-jae stood up. It was not the slow, deliberate rise of the morning's desk conversation with Park Jun. He came out of the chair with a speed that made Park Jun sit back involuntarily, and he came around the desk, and the temperature in the room dropped in the way it did when Min-jae stopped managing himself. He profiled my wife, Min-jae said. Yes. On whose instruction? I don't know yet. It could be reconnaissance, building leverage against you through her. Park Jun stood too now, not defensively, but because sitting felt wrong. Or it could be something operational. If someone wants to apply pressure on you through her, where is he now? Not a question, an accounting request. His apartment in Yongsan. He has a car in the basement. I have someone on the building. Park Jun paused. Min-jae, what do you want to do? Min-jae walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room, hands at his sides, and he looked at the garden below. The stone bench he'd never sat on. The path through the hedgerow that no one walked. Evidence of a beautiful, cared-for space that no one actually used, which was, he thought in one disassociated corner of his brain, the most accurate metaphor he'd ever been surrounded by. His wife's name in a file prepared by a man he had trusted for 9 years. Her schedule, her friends. The children she tutored, Malcolm Reed's name. If someone moved against Nia, not to hurt her, but to use her against him, to apply the kind of pressure that changed outcomes, she would not see it coming. She was warm and open, and she moved through the world trusting it in the way that people who have not lived in his world continued to trust it, because no one had yet demonstrated to them specifically that they shouldn't. He thought about her at the literacy center in her practical shoes, coming through the door, already smiling before she reached it. He thought about the children running toward her. He thought about Malcolm Reed leaning down to hear a small girl's story. He thought about Byun's file sitting on a server somewhere with Nia's name on it. Lock Byun's access, Min-jae said, still facing the window. Every channel he uses, every entry point he has to any system we run, cut it off as of right now. Don't move on him yet. I want to know who he's working for first. I know how long it'll take, do it. He turned from the window. And I want eyes on Nia. Not surveillance, protection. 2 people, minimum. At all times she's outside the estate. She doesn't know. She doesn't see them. If anyone within 1 block of her shows an unusual pattern of behavior, I hear about it immediately. Park Jun nodded. And if someone tries to move on her? Then I hear about it before they finish the thought. His voice had the quality now of something that was not performed calm, actual calm, the kind that came from having moved past the consideration of options into the simple clarity of commitment. Anything else I need to know right now? Park Jun hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Her lawyer filed the initial divorce paperwork with the court this morning. Min-jae looked at him. I didn't know you'd received the documents until Ji-hye mentioned the courier. I'm sorry, I should have been monitoring. You weren't supposed to be monitoring that. I know. Min-jae stood in the center of his study. The divorce filing, Byun, the profile on Nia. It had all arrived in the same 12-hour window. Not coincidence. He did not believe in coincidence at the operational level. And the shape of it was becoming clear in the way that patterns always eventually became clear if you looked at them without preference for a particular outcome. Someone had been watching him. Not just his business operations. Him. His personal vulnerabilities. And Byun, who knew more about the architecture of his private life than almost anyone, had mapped those vulnerabilities and handed the map to a party Min-jae had not yet identified. The divorce filing was in the public record now. His marriage dissolving was information. It meant he was reachable in a way he had not been before. "Get me a name," Min-jae said. "I don't care what it costs. I want the name of whoever Byun is working for, and I want it before the end of the week." Park Jun moved to the door. He stopped. "One more thing. The literacy center." Min-jae looked at him. Byun's file on the center included a note about their lease situation. The building owner's contract comes up in 2 months. The note flagged that a third-party property group has already approached the owner about a buyout. He kept his face neutral. "I don't know yet if there's a connection." The room was very quiet. "Find out," Min-jae said. Park Jun left. Min-jae stood alone in his study. Someone was using his marriage, using the specific soft geography of his wife's life, her schedule, her friends, her volunteer work with immigrant children, as a map of his exposure. They had found the places where he could be reached, and they were pressing on them systematically, and they had timed it, either by design or by luck, to coincide with the moment when his marriage was most visibly failing. He thought about the cedar box on the shelf in the reading room. He thought about Nia's handwriting on recipe cards annotated with small kindnesses he had never acknowledged. He thought about the fact that the most honest sentence he had written in years was sitting folded in his jacket pocket, and he had written it about himself. "I built her a cage and called it protection." He went back to his desk. He pulled out a legal pad and a pen, and he began writing. Not plans, not lists, not operational frameworks. He wrote what he knew, in order, from the beginning. The bookstore awning. The coffee cups. Byun's file. The cedar box. The letter with its one clean, devastating line. The divorce papers filed this morning. Byun's profile of Nia. The lease on the literacy center. The Singapore Shell Company. He wrote until the picture became visible. Then he sat back and looked at what he'd written and understood the specific nature of the trap he was standing inside. He could respond to this the way he had always responded to threats. With resources, with leverage, with the machinery of an organization built to project force and neutralize opposition. He could find Byun's employer and make the cost of this particular strategy prohibitive. He could secure the literacy center's lease. He could protect Nia physically in ways she would never know about. He could do all of it, and it would work, mechanically, and Nia would still be gone. The divorce was filed. The letter had been written months ago. The cedar box had been waiting on the shelf for years. None of that was the trap. None of that was the threat he needed to neutralize. The trap was simpler and more absolute than anything a rival organization could have designed. He had become, somewhere in the 16 years of building an empire that no one could touch, a man that the woman who loved him most could not stay with. That was the thing requiring change. Not his operations, not his network, not Byun or the Singapore Shell or the property group circling the literacy center's lease. Him. He looked at the legal pad. He picked up the pen. Below everything he'd written, at the bottom of the page, he wrote one more sentence, and this one he did not fold and put in his pocket. He left it on the desk where he could see it. The only thing left to protect is the man she married, not the one he became. He picked up his phone and called a number he had not called in 2 years. His personal attorney, not the organization's. A man who handled only Min-jae's private affairs. "I need to discuss a divorce response," he said when the man answered. Not to contest it, to make the terms fair. He listened to the silence on the other end. "I'll explain when I see you," he said. "Tomorrow morning." He hung up. He sat in the quiet of his study as the afternoon light began to go long and orange through the windows. And he did not feel like a man who had made a strategic decision. He felt like a man who had finally stopped lying to himself about what he'd broken, and how, and who understood that repair, if it was possible at all, began not with power but with the thing he had always been worst at, showing up before he was forced to. He pulled his jacket from the back of the chair and stood and straightened his tie by reflex. And then he stopped, looked down at the tie, and took it off. He left it on the desk next to the legal pad. He walked out of the study, through the entrance hall, and out the front door into the early evening, and he drove himself, not to the office, not to any meeting, to a hardware store in Mapo district, because Park Jun had mentioned that the Literacy Center's bookshelves were in need of repair, and Min-jae Kang, feared head of Seoul's most consequential criminal organization, knew how to do exactly one useful domestic thing. He could fix a broken shelf. It was not enough, but it was something, and he was going to start with something because he had finally understood that starting with everything was exactly what had emptied the house behind him. The hardware store in Mapo was the kind of place that had been in the same location for 20 years and would be there for 20 more. Narrow aisles, fluorescent lighting, a man at the counter who looked like he'd seen everything and found most of it unremarkable. Min-jae walked in still in his dress shirt, no tie, and stood in the fasteners aisle for 3 minutes trying to remember what kind of bracket worked for a wall-mounted shelf unit. He had not done this himself, and he couldn't calculate how long. He had people for this. He had always had people for this. He took out his phone and searched it. The man at the counter watched him without expression. He bought brackets, wood screws, a screwdriver set because he wasn't certain which size he'd need, and a small level. The total came to less than he spent on a single lunch. He paid in cash because he had cash in his pocket, and because the idea of using the card attached to his organization's expense account to buy shelf brackets felt wrong in a way he didn't fully analyze. He drove home. He did not go to the literacy center that evening. It was already past 7 and the center would be closed. He understood that. He had bought the supplies as an act of intention, not an act he could complete tonight, and he let that be what it was. He was learning, slowly and with considerable resistance from his own nature, to let things be what they were without forcing resolution. He ate alone. He made the food himself, poorly, from ingredients that had been in the refrigerator without specific purpose, assembled into something edible without being good. He sat at the kitchen island and ate it, and thought about the recipe cards in the cedar box, and about a woman who had written "add ginger." If he's had a hard week, and had never once been asked how her week was going. His phone sat face up on the counter and did not ring, which meant Park Jun was working and had nothing to report yet, which was not reassuring. He washed his own plate. He went to bed before midnight for the first time in longer than he could pinpoint, and he lay in the dark listening to the house, and somewhere on the other side of a wall or a floor or whatever geometry separated their rooms at this point, Nia was there. And he did not knock, and he did not call her name, and he did not do anything except lie still and let the fact of her presence in the same building be the thing it was, provisional, diminishing, not promised tomorrow. He slept 4 hours. It was more than he expected. Park Jun called at 6:47 in the morning. "I have a name," he said. Min-jae was already dressed. He had been awake since 6, standing at the kitchen window with bad coffee he'd made himself, watching the garden go from dark to gray to the particular flat morning light of November. "Tell me." Han Seong-il. Min-jae set the coffee mug down. Han Seong-il was 71 years old. He had been, for the better part of 3 decades, the closest thing to a rival power structure that existed within Min-jae's operational geography. Not an enemy, they had maintained a careful distance, a professional mutual recognition that their respective territories did not require conflict because they did not genuinely overlap. Han ran older money, quieter money, private equity structures, government contracting, the particular kind of influence that lived in meeting rooms and was never discussed openly. Min-jae's organization was operational, transactional, built on logistics and enforcement. Han's was institutional, embedded, built on relationships that had calcified into something resembling legitimacy over decades. They had met 4 times in 12 years. Each meeting had been cordial. Each meeting had communicated, beneath the courtesy, that both parties understood the landscape precisely and preferred it unchanged. "You're certain," Min-jae said. "The Singapore shell traces to a holding group that Han has used before through different configurations. Different enough that it took until last night to confirm. My source in the Port Authority cross-referenced with a banking contact." A pause. "It's him." Min-jae picked the mug back up and held it without drinking. He thought about Han Seong-il in the way he thought about all complex situations from the structure outward. What Han wanted. what the Incheon warehouse represented in that want, what Bayun's surveillance of Nia indicated about the strategy. Han was not trying to take his shipping operation. The Busan license, the Incheon warehouse, those were pressure points, not objectives. Han was trying to destabilize him, create enough operational disruption, enough personal exposure, enough visible vulnerability that Min-jae's own network would begin to question the solidity of his leadership. In a structure built on the projection of invulnerability, visible fractures were more dangerous than direct attacks. And the surveillance on Nia had not been preparation for a physical move against her. It had been something more sophisticated and more cruel: documentation. Evidence that Min-jae Kang's personal life was in disorder, that the man who claimed to see everything had not seen what was happening in his own home. That kind of information, released carefully into the right channels, did more damage than any direct confrontation. Han had been building a portrait of a man losing control. And Min-jae, without knowing it, had been sitting for it faithfully for months. The Literacy Center lease, Min-jae said, the property group that approached the owner. Also traceable to Han, indirectly through a third party, but traceable. Park Jun's voice was careful. I don't think the intent is to shut the center down. I think the intent is to give them the option of applying pressure on you through it at a moment of their choosing. Using Nia. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird moved in the garden. Min-jae watched it without registering what kind it was. Set up a meeting with Han, he said. Private. Not through intermediaries. I want him to know the contact is coming directly from me, today if possible. He'll know you've identified him. That's the point. Silence on the line for a moment. And Byun? Not yet. Byun stays exactly where he is and believes his access is intact. If we move on him now, Han knows we've unwound the thread and has time to reposition. Min-jae put the mug in the sink. We move on Byun after I've spoken with Han. Understood. Another pause. There's one more thing. Min-jae waited. Nia's lawyer contacted our legal office yesterday afternoon. Apparently she wants to accelerate the timeline on the filing. She's asked for the preliminary mediation session to be scheduled within 3 weeks. The sink was in front of him, and he was looking at the drain. Schedule it, he said. Min-jae, schedule it, June. Give them whatever date they ask for. He ended the call. He picked up the bag from the hardware store, which he'd left on the counter the night before, and he drove to Mapo District. The Literacy Center didn't open until 9. He arrived at 8:40 and sat outside in his car for 20 minutes, and then he got out, took the bag from the back seat, and stood at the front door. There was a handwritten schedule posted in the window listing volunteer hours and program times, and below it someone had taped a child's drawing of what appeared to be a dragon reading a book. He stood there looking at the dragon until the door was unlocked from inside by a small woman in her 50s who looked at him and then at the bag in his hand and then at his face. We're not open yet, she said in Korean. I know, he said, also in Korean. I heard the bookshelves in the back room need repair. I brought the right brackets. He held up the bag slightly. I can wait until you're ready for me. She looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open. He waited in the front room on a plastic chair that was sized for children and was therefore deeply uncomfortable for a man of his build. And he looked at the walls, which were covered with drawings and photographs and handwritten English and Korean vocabulary words, and a large map of the world with strings connecting different countries to the city of Seoul. Many strings. A lot of countries. He was looking at the map when a voice behind him said, You're Min-jae. He turned. Malcolm Reed was standing in the doorway to the back room with a paper cup in each hand and an expression that was not hostile, but was not comfortable either. The careful calibration of a man who understood exactly who he was looking at and had decided in advance to be honest about that. I am, Min-jae said. He stood. The plastic chair made a sound. Malcolm looked at the hardware store bag. Mrs. and said, You're here about the shelves. Yes. A pause. Malcolm extended one of the cups. I made extra. Min-jae took the cup. They stood facing each other in the front room of a literacy center in Mapo District at 8:55 in the morning, two men who had been aware of each other's existence for weeks and were now 3 feet apart, and neither of them said anything for a moment. She told me about you, Malcolm said. Nia, not much, but some. What did she tell you? That you're not a bad person. He said it plainly, without editorial. She was very specific about that. Not a bad person, just someone who got lost. Min-jae looked at the coffee cup in his hand. She's generous. She is, Malcolm nodded once. It's not always easy to be around. Something in that landed differently than Min-jae expected. He looked up. Malcolm was watching him with a directness that was neither aggressive nor compassionate, just honest, in the way of someone who had spent enough time around difficult truths that he'd stopped dressing them up. I'm not, Min-jae started, stopped. I'm not here about her. I know, Malcolm said. The shelves have been broken for 2 months. We appreciate it. He moved toward the back room. Come on, I'll show you which ones. He spent 3 hours on the shelves. It was harder than he'd estimated and took longer than it should have. And at one point he put a bracket in at the wrong angle and had to remove it and reseat it. And Malcolm, who was organizing a book delivery in the same room, said nothing about it and did not offer to help until Min-jae asked which he did, once, about the wall material behind the drywall. Children began arriving at 9. They moved around Min-jae with the unself-conscious adaptability of children who were used to new adults appearing in their spaces. And 2 of them asked what he was doing, and he told them he was fixing the shelves. And one of them asked why they were broken, and he said because they had been holding too much for too long without the right support, and the child accepted this and moved on. He finished at 11:40. He stood back and looked at the work. The shelves were level, he'd checked twice, and solid. He pressed against the lowest one with his palm, and it didn't shift. Malcolm looked up from across the room. Good? Good, Min-jae said. He packed the tools back into the bag. His shirt was untucked and there was dust on his forearm, and his hands had the particular grime of hardware work, which he had not experienced in a very long time, and which was, he noticed, not entirely unpleasant. He was putting his jacket on when Nia walked in. She came through the front door with her tote bag over one shoulder, and her coat still on, and she was already talking to the woman at the front desk, and then she turned toward the back room and stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. She looked at the shelves, then at the hardware bag in his hand, then at his face again, and the expression that moved through hers was something he did not have a word for, not the versions of her face he'd catalogued over 4 years of marriage. Not surprise exactly, not softness. Something that arrived before those things and sat underneath them. The brackets were the right size, he said, because he had to say something, and that was the most honest thing available. Nia stood in the doorway to the back room for a moment. I see that, she said. She went to her coat hook and hung up her things and began her morning. She did not say anything else to him, and he did not press for anything else. He picked up the bag and said goodbye to Malcolm, who shook his hand, firm, uncomplicated, the handshake of a man who had decided this person was worth the dignity of a real greeting. And he walked out through the front room and past the map with all its strings and out into the gray November morning. He sat in his car. His hands were still dirty. He sat there for a few minutes, and then he drove to meet Han Seong-il. The meeting was in a private room at a restaurant in Jongno that Han owned through a holding company, which Min-jae knew and Han knew he knew. And the choice of location was therefore a statement. I'm not hiding what I am. Neither should you. Han was already seated when Min-jae arrived. 71 years old, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of old money, the kind that didn't move quickly because it didn't need to. He had tea in front of him and a newspaper folded to one side, and he looked like a man meeting a business acquaintance for lunch. Min-jae sat down across from him without removing his jacket. You have dust on your sleeve, Han said. I was doing some repair work this morning. Han looked at him with an expression of genuine curiosity that Min-jae recognized as its own kind of performance. You could have sent someone. I wanted to do it myself. A pause. Han lifted his tea. You requested this meeting very directly. I wanted you to know it was coming from me. I appreciated that. He set the cup down. It suggests you know something. I know enough, Min-jae said. The Singapore structure, Byun, the Incheon lease, the property group circling the literacy center. He held Han's gaze. I know enough. Han was quiet for a moment, then, you've been paying closer attention lately. Yes. Something changed. Several things changed. Min-jae put both forearms on the table. I'm here to tell you that the strategy isn't going to work. And I want to tell you directly because I prefer directness, and because I think you do too. Han tilted his head slightly. Tell me why it won't work. Because it was built on an assumption that's no longer accurate. Min-jae kept his voice even. You assumed that my marriage was a vulnerability because I couldn't afford to have it publicly fail. That the optics of a visible personal crisis would create enough uncertainty in my network to open space for you to move operationally. He paused. That was a reasonable assumption 6 months ago. And now? Now I'm the one who opened the divorce timeline. I contacted my personal attorney to ensure the terms are fair to her. I'm not contesting it. There's no crisis to exploit because I'm not pretending there isn't one. He let that sit for a moment. You spent 14 months building leverage on a door I've already opened from the inside. Han studied him. The curiosity in his expression had shifted into something more genuine. Assessment, the real kind, the kind that an old man with Han's history engaged in when something surprised him. That's an expensive position, Han said, walking away from the marriage on those terms. Yes. And the organization, the perception of instability, is being managed. Min-jae held his gaze. I have been running this organization for 16 years. I know how to manage perception. He leaned back slightly. What I'm less experienced at is recognizing when the perception I'm managing most aggressively is my own. The private room was very quiet. Somewhere outside the door, the restaurant was filling for lunch, and the distant sound of it, voices, kitchen noise, the specific ambient sound of people eating together, pressed against the silence between the two men. Han picked up his tea again. He drank it slowly. He set it down. Byun, he said. Yes. He came to me, Han said. I want you to know that. I didn't recruit him. He came with information about your personal situation and offered it as a foundation for a business arrangement. A pause. I accepted. I won't pretend otherwise. I know. What do you want from this meeting? Min-jae was quiet for a moment. I want the property group to release its interest in the Literacy Center lease. Clean withdrawal, no residual pressure, no future approaches to the owner. He held Han's eyes. That's a small thing for you. It's important to me. Han looked at him for a long time. Because of your wife. Because children learn to read there, Min-jae said. And because, yes, my wife. He held the older man's gaze. I know I have no leverage in this room that you haven't already mapped. I'm asking you directly, which is the only currency I can spend today, man to man. The silence stretched. Han exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the sound of a man making a calculation that surprised even himself. The property group will withdraw, Han said, within 48 hours. Min-jae nodded once. Byun, Han said again, is my problem. And between us? Between us, Min-jae said, I want nothing from you, and I'm asking nothing beyond what I just asked. The Incheon situation, the shipping complications. I'll rebuild those through different channels. You keep what you took. I don't move against your structures. He paused. This conversation ends here. Han looked at him with something that might, in a different light, have been respect. You're a different man than I was expecting. I'm a different man than I was expecting, Min-jae said. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Han Seong-il across the table one last time. The old power and the new one in the same room, both of them knowing that something had shifted in the landscape without either of them being able to name it cleanly. Thank you for the meeting, Min-jae said. He walked out. He drove directly from the restaurant to the industrial building in Yongsan where Byun kept his secondary office. Park Jun was already there with two men Min-jae trusted, parked outside in a dark vehicle, and he got in without ceremony. He's inside, Park Jun said. Has been for 2 hours. Anyone with him? One. An assistant who doesn't know anything. I'm certain of that. Min-jae looked at the building. 11 years. He had given Byun access to the most sensitive architecture of his private operations because he had trusted him with the consistency of someone who had never yet been given a reason not to. He had trusted him carefully and completely, and Byun had sold the blueprint of that trust to an old man who drank tea in a restaurant he owned and read folded newspapers while he waited. Send the assistant home, Min-jae said. Tell him there's a water issue in the building. Do it now, before we go in. Park Jun sent a message. They waited 4 minutes. The assistant came out of the building, pulling his collar up against the cold, and walked toward the subway entrance without looking back. Min-jae got out of the car. He went in through the front entrance and up the stairs to the second floor and pushed open the door to Byun's office without knocking. Byun was at his desk. He was a slight man, 53, with glasses he'd worn for as long as Min-jae had known him, and he looked up from his computer screen with an expression that went through three different things in the space of a second: recognition, calculation, and then, because he was not a stupid man, understanding. He did not run. Min-jae respected that, slightly. "I'm going to ask you one question," Min-jae said, and he closed the door behind him and stayed near it, which was deliberate. He was not coming across the room. He was not raising his voice. He was keeping every signal in the room at the lowest possible register, because this was not a moment for theater and because what he needed from Byun was information, not an audience. Byun's hands were flat on the desk. His breathing had changed. "Why my wife?" Min-jae said. Not, "Why did you betray me?" Not, "How long?" Not any of the other questions that existed in the room. Just that one. Byun held his gaze for a moment. Then something in his face cracked open. Not dramatically, just a small collapse around the eyes. The expression of a man who has carried something and finally sets it down because there is no point anymore in carrying it. "Han wanted the weakest point," Byun said. His voice was steady but thin. "I told him there wasn't one. He said there always is. I told him you were careful. He said careful men have things they're careless about." He paused. "I'm sorry. I know that—" "Don't," Min-jae said. "Don't put the apology in the sentence with the explanation. They don't belong together." Byun closed his mouth. Was anyone going to move against her physically? No. The file was for leverage documentation only. Pressure on you, not— No. I made that a condition. He said it like a man presenting a credit in his ledger. The look on Min-jae's face told him how it landed. "Your access is already closed," Min-jae said. "Every channel, every system, as of yesterday morning. You have nothing left to offer Han or anyone else." He paused. "You have 48 hours to leave Seoul. Take whatever is yours and go. I will not come after you if you go clean and stay gone." He put his hand on the door. "If I learn you've made contact with anyone in my organization, or Han's, or any other structure in this city, the 48 hours becomes something else." He opened the door. "Min-jae." Byun's voice, quiet. "She was the only person in your life who—" "I know what she was," Min-jae said, without turning around. He walked out. He went down the stairs and out the front, and got into the car where Park Jun was waiting. He sat back against the seat and looked at the building through the window, and his jaw was tight, and his hands in his lap were not quite still. "Done?" Park Jun said. "Done." He exhaled. "The protection detail on Nia. Keep it in place through the end of the month. After that, we'll reassess." "And Byun?" "He'll be gone." He looked at Park Jun. "If he's not, you'll know." Park Jun nodded. He started the car. They drove in silence through Yongsan and back toward the river, and the city went past the windows the way it always did. Constant, indifferent, moving at its own pace regardless of what any individual man inside it was surviving. Min-jae looked at his hands. The grime from the hardware work was mostly gone, washed off in the restaurant bathroom before he'd gone in to meet Han. But there was still a line of it in the crease of his right palm where he'd gripped the screwdriver, and he looked at it for a long time. He thought about the shelf he'd built that morning. Level and solid. Children would put books on it by afternoon. He thought about Nia's face when she came through the door and saw him standing there with the hardware bag. He thought about what Malcolm Reed had said. Not a bad person, just someone who got lost. He thought about the mediation session, 3 weeks. His personal attorney and her attorney in a room discussing the terms of a marriage ending, and Min-jae had told his lawyer to make the terms fair, which meant whatever she needed, which meant the estate if she wanted it, which meant he would start again from a smaller space and build differently if he built it all. The car crossed the river on a bridge Min-jae had driven across hundreds of times without looking at the water. He looked at it now. The Han River in November was the color of old pewter, flat-surfaced, enormous, completely unimpressed by the city growing on both its banks. It moved without rushing, going somewhere it had always been going, unhurried in the way of things that understood their direction so completely they had no need to announce it. He watched it until the bridge was behind them. "Take me home," he said. He was not going to the office. He was going to the estate, which was large and quiet and mostly empty, and which contained on a shelf in the reading room a small cedar box and a stack of unsent letters. And he was going to sit in that room tonight, for the first time since this all began. Without the protection of work or distance or the managed calm he had built into every muscle over 40 years. He was going to sit with what he'd done and what it had cost and what, if anything, was left on the other side of the cost. He did not know what he was going to find there. That was the part that made his hands move very slightly in his lap, the part no one in the car could see and which he didn't try to stop. The car moved through the city. The mediation was in 3 weeks. The literacy center's lease was safe. Bune was already gone in every way that mattered. And somewhere in a house on a hillside north of the city, a woman named Nia Brooks was deciding, with the same careful honesty she had brought to everything, what came next. Min-jae Kang, who had never once in 16 years entered a room without knowing the outcome in advance, was going home to wait without knowing anything at all. He sat in the reading room until 2 in the morning. He did not turn on the overhead light. There was a small lamp on the side table beside the reading chair, and he turned that on, and it threw a warm, limited circle that barely reached the bookshelf where the cedar box sat. He sat in the chair, Nia's chair, the one shaped to her particular way of sitting, slightly tilted toward the lamp, and he did not pick up the box or the letters. He just sat in the room where she spent her evenings and let the room be what it was. It smelled like her. He had noticed this before. He let himself notice it now without moving past it. He thought about the mediation in 3 weeks. He thought about his personal attorney, a careful man named O, who had handled his private affairs for 8 years, and who had said, on the phone, with the practiced neutrality of a man paid to withhold opinions, "I want to make sure I understand your position. You want the terms to favor her." And Min-jae had said yes, and O had been quiet for a moment and then said he would prepare accordingly. He thought about what fair meant, practically. The estate, the accounts she had access to, the foundation she had quietly begun building through her volunteer work, the one she hadn't told him about because she had learned not to bring him things he wouldn't have time for. He would fund it. Not as a gesture and not as a transaction, as a correction, as the most concrete acknowledgement he could make that her work had value independent of whether he had ever noticed it. He thought about the cedar box and what it would mean to give it back to her, whether that was something she would want or something she would read as another kind of pressure. He left the box on the shelf. He turned off the lamp at 2 and went to bed and slept 6 hours, which was, by recent measure, a significant improvement. The 2 weeks before mediation moved the way time moves when you are waiting for something you cannot rush and cannot avoid, in uneven increments, some days going fast and others going almost still. He went to the literacy center on Tuesdays. He went on Thursdays. He carried boxes and fixed things and read to children when the regular volunteers were occupied and made himself useful in the specific, physical, non-glamorous ways that organizations like this one needed people to be useful. He did not announce himself. He did not bring anything that cost money. He brought time, which was the thing he had spent 16 years treating as the most precious and non-transferable of his resources, and he gave it to a room full of children learning to read in their second and third languages, which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly where it should have been going. He met a 7-year-old boy named Danny who was learning Korean from scratch, and who had decided, with the absolute certainty of very young children, that Min-jae was his personal assistant in this project. Danny would find him within 2 minutes of his arrival and drag him to whatever worksheet or picture book he was working on and explain, with great seriousness, what was happening and what Min-jae's role in it was going to be. Min-jae sat in chairs that were too small for him and sounded out Korean syllables with a 7-year-old who corrected his pronunciation without mercy, and he was not sure he had ever done anything that felt more honest. He saw Nia at the center on Tuesdays. They did not avoid each other, and they did not seek each other out. They moved through the same space with the careful awareness of 2 people who knew each other completely and were navigating what that knowledge meant now. Sometimes she handed him something, a stack of books to shelve, a supply bag to carry to the back room, with the practical ease of 2 people working in the same direction. Sometimes she looked at him from across the room and didn't look away immediately, which he received as neither invitation nor rejection, just observation. He was being looked at by his wife. He was being seen, finally, and he understood that being seen meant being seen accurately. Not the version of himself he projected, not the managed surface, but the man carrying donated books in a too-small room trying to sound out syllables correctly for a 7-year-old. He let her see that. He stopped managing the surface and let the actual thing be visible. He did not know if it was enough. He did not ask. Malcolm Reed found him in the supply closet on a Thursday afternoon where Min-jae had been trying for 20 minutes to reorganize a shelf system that someone had reassembled incorrectly and which was now structurally unstable. "It's been like that for a month," Malcolm said from the doorway. "Nobody wanted to take it apart again." "It needs to come apart before it can go back together right," Min-jae said, without looking up. Malcolm leaned against the doorframe. He had a coffee cup. He seemed to do most things with a coffee cup in hand, which Min-jae had noticed before, and which he had decided was not an affectation, but simply the way the man moved through his day. "Can I ask you something?" Malcolm said. Min-jae looked up. "Yes." "Why here?" He said it without particular edge, just genuine inquiry. I know what you have. I'm not naive about who you are. Why are you here in a supply closet taking apart a shelf?" Min-jae looked at the shelf. He thought about how to answer in a way that was honest without being a performance of honesty, which was itself a new kind of problem for him. "Because it needs to be done," he said. "And because I'm the one who showed up." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" "That's it." Malcolm drank his coffee. "She's not going to come back to you because you fix things." Min-jae looked at him. "I know that. I want to make sure you know that, because I've seen people do generous things with an audience in mind." He held Min-jae's gaze steady and without apology. "She'd know the difference. She always knows the difference." "I know she does," Min-jae said. "That's why I'm not doing it for her." He turned back to the shelf. "I'm doing it because the shelf is broken and children put their things on it and it should hold what they put on it." He pulled the loose bracket free. "That's all." Malcolm stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he came into the closet and crouched down on the other side of the unit. "The left side needs a wall anchor, not just a bracket," he said. "The drywall there is soft." "I know. I have the anchor in the bag." They worked in silence for 20 minutes. When the shelf was reassembled correctly and solidly, Malcolm stood and pressed the top board with both hands. It held. "Good," he said. "Yes," Min-jae said. Malcolm looked at him across the shelf unit with the same directness he'd had in every conversation they'd had, which was not many, but each of which had been, Min-jae thought, more honest than most of the conversations he'd had in the past several years combined. "She talks about Chicago sometimes," Malcolm said. "Her family there. Her mother." He paused. "She misses being somewhere she belongs without having to explain herself." Min-jae held the other man's gaze. "I know. I'm not saying that to... I know why you're saying it." He picked up the tool bag. "You're saying it because you're her friend, and you're checking whether I understand what I did." He looked at Malcolm. "I understand what I did." Malcolm nodded once. There was nothing combative in it. He extended his hand and Min-jae took it, and they shook. The same handshake as before, firm, direct, the handshake of two men who had looked at each other clearly enough to skip the performance. "She's lucky to have someone who shows up for her," Min-jae said, and he meant it without pain, or with pain that was not Malcolm's fault and was therefore not Malcolm's to carry. "She shows up for herself," Malcolm said. "She always has." Min-jae picked up his bag and walked out. The mediation was on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock in an office in Seocho District, on the 14th floor of a building that looked like every other building in that part of the city. Clean, corporate, anonymous. Min-jae arrived 7 minutes early. His attorney Oh was already in the anteroom, a compact man with a briefcase he'd carried for 20 years and an expression of permanent, careful neutrality. They did not go over strategy in the waiting room because Min-jae had already told him the strategy, which was not a strategy so much as a position, whatever she needs. Oh had written it down. He had not offered an opinion. Min-jae respected him for that. Nia arrived with her attorney at 3 minutes past 9. She was wearing a dark blazer and dark trousers, her hair up, and she looked composed in the way that Min-jae had come to understand meant she had done her composure work before she arrived and was not going to need to do it in the room. She looked at him when she came in, and he looked at her and he kept his face open, not managed, just present. She looked tired. Not frail, tired in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten very good at carrying it, but whose body remembered the weight regardless. They sat across from each other at a rectangular table. A mediator, a calm, unhurried woman named Shin, who seemed to approach the whole proceeding with the professional equanimity of someone who had seen every variation of this particular human situation, laid out the structure of the session. Min-jae listened. When she finished, Shin looked at him. "Mr. Kang, my understanding is that you've instructed your counsel that you're not contesting any of the primary terms. Is that accurate?" "Yes," he said. Shin looked at Nia's attorney, a woman named Park Sarah, who had the contained intensity of someone who had prepared for a fight and was recalibrating. "Would you like to proceed through the asset schedule or begin with the questions of property?" Nia's attorney looked at her client. Nia was looking at Min-jae. "Why?" Nia said. Not to the mediator, not to the attorneys, to him, directly across the table. The room shifted slightly. Shin was too professional to show surprise, but she did not interrupt. "Why are you not contesting it?" Nia said. Her voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something that needed the question answered. Not strategy, not suspicion exactly, something more raw than either. She had prepared to fight for what she needed, and he had removed the fight, and she needed to understand why, because she had known him for 6 years, and she understood that he did nothing without reason. Min-jae looked at her across the table. "Because it's fair," he said, "and because fighting it would mean trying to hold something in place that I let fall apart." He paused. "I don't want to hold it in place. I want to make it right." Making it right and not contesting a divorce are two different things. "I know. I'm doing both." She held his gaze. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she did not move them. "You've been at the center," she said. "Yes." "For 2 months." "Yes." "Every Tuesday and Thursday." "Yes." A pause. "Danny talks about you," she said, and something moved through her face when she said it. Involuntary, not managed, the particular expression of someone ambushed by their own feeling. "He's teaching me Korean," Min-jae said. She looked down at her hands for a moment. When she looked back up, the composure was still there, but it was carrying more weight than it had been. "I don't know what you want," she said. "I need you to tell me what you actually want, because I can't—" She stopped. Started again. "I've spent 4 years trying to read what you needed and filling in the silence because you wouldn't, and I can't do that anymore. Whatever this is, you need to say it plainly." Min-jae looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I want to give you back the version of our life that you deserved from the beginning," he said. "I know that's not possible. I know we don't go backward." He kept his voice level. "What I want, plainly, is for you to have what you need to build whatever comes next. The estate, the foundation, the accounts, all of it. And I want the literacy center's lease secure, which it is. I handled that separately. It's not conditional on anything." He paused. "I want Danny to have somewhere to learn Korean for as long as he needs it. That's what I want." Nia was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not in 6 years. He could not name it. It was not the love from a distance expression of her last letter. It was not the careful managed warmth she'd worn in public beside him. It was something more unguarded than either, something that arrived in her eyes before the rest of her face knew what to do with it. She looked at her attorney. "Can we have a few minutes?" she said. They stood in a small conference room adjacent to the mediation suite, just the two of them. The attorneys remained at the table on the other side of the door, which Nia had closed firmly. The room had a window that looked out at other buildings. Min-jae stood near it. Nia stood near the door. There were 8 feet between them, roughly, and nothing else. "The cedar box," she said. He waited. "Did you open it?" "Yes." "When?" "The morning after you sent the papers." He held her gaze. "I sat on the floor of your reading room and I read everything." Her jaw tightened slightly, which meant she was feeling something specific and was deciding whether to let it show. He recognized this because he had spent years doing the same thing to her, and he knew what it looked like from the outside now. "I wrote those letters for years," she said. "I never gave them to you because—" She stopped. "I kept waiting for the right time and the right time never came." "I know. You read them all." "Yes." She turned and looked at the window. at the buildings outside, the city going on at its usual pace. She crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively, more like she was holding something in from the outside. "The recipes," she said quietly. "Your notes in the margins." She exhaled. "Your mother's dishes. I found them through... There was a woman at your mother's building, a neighbor who had known her for 30 years. I visited her twice. She wrote them out for me." She paused. "You never said anything." "I didn't know. I didn't ask where the food came from. I just ate it." He heard how that sounded. "I'm sorry. Not as a transaction. Just, I'm sorry." She turned back from the window. She looked at him with those 8 feet between them, and the full weight of everything that had passed between them. The good years and the receding ones, and the letters never sent, and the box never opened, and the gradual dimming that neither of them had named until it was nearly dark. "I don't hate you," she said. "I told you that in the letter." "I know. I meant it. I know that too." She uncrossed her arms and let them fall to her sides. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, and it came out differently from everything else she'd said. More exposed, less constructed. "I planned to come in here and get through it, and walk out and start building something new. And then you're sitting there not contesting anything, and you're apparently the person Danny won't stop talking about. And She pressed her lips together. "I don't know what I'm doing." "You don't have to know," he said. "Not today." "That's easy for you to say." "It's not easy for me to say. I'm the reason you're in this room." He took a breath. "I know what I did, Nia. Not the list of things, the shape of it, what it cost you. I know now." He paused. "I'm not saying it so you'll do anything. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear it said directly, without management, without agenda." She was looking at him steadily. "I left you alone in a house," he said, "for years. I was there, physically, and I left you alone. And you loved me through it with a patience that I did not deserve and did not see until you had already decided you were done waiting, and that's the truth of what happened." He held her gaze. "I needed you to hear me say it without anything attached to it." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, a bird moved between buildings. They both saw it without commenting on it. "The estate," Nia said finally. "I don't want the estate." He blinked. "It's yours if you want it." "I don't want it." She was firm about this, not angry, just clear. "It's too large and too quiet, and every room in it has been decorated by someone who doesn't know either of us." She looked at him. "I want the apartment, the one I kept from before the marriage, in Mapo. My name has been on the lease this whole time." A pause. "I never gave it up. I kept paying it." He stood very still. "I don't know what that means," she said. "I'm not sure I knew what it meant when I was doing it. Probably something about needing to know there was somewhere that was just mine." She looked at him. "But I want that. And I want the foundation funded, and I want the center's lease protected." "Done," he said. "All of it." "And I want time," she said. I don't know what's happening right now between us in this room, and I need time to not know it before I make any decisions. Take whatever time you need." "I'm serious. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what I need." "I know the difference," he said. "I understand." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the door and put her hand on the handle and stopped. "The recipe for the miyokguk," she said. "Your mother's version. The neighbor told me the secret ingredient was patience, that you had to let the seaweed sit longer than felt right." He didn't say anything. "I thought about that a lot," she said, "whether patience was actually the ingredient or whether at some point patience just becomes a different problem." She opened the door. She walked back into the mediation room. He stood at the window for a moment. He watched the buildings. He thought about a woman who had kept an apartment in Mapo for 4 years with her name on the lease, paying it every month, maintaining the smallest possible version of a life that was entirely her own, just in case she needed it. He thought that was the most practical act of love he had ever heard of. He walked back into the mediation room and sat down. Wolto. The mediation concluded in 2 hours. The terms were agreed, documented, and initialed. Attorney O would handle the filings. Park Sarah, across the table, had stopped recalibrating and was now simply working efficiently, which Min-jae took as a sign that she was a good attorney who could recognize when the situation had changed and adapt accordingly. When it was finished, the attorneys stepped out to coordinate paperwork. Min-jae and Nia remained at the table for a moment in the aftermath of the process. The mediator, Shin, gathered her materials with quiet efficiency and excused herself, leaving the door open behind her in the tactful way of people who understood when two people needed a doorway. "I'll stop by the center on Saturday," Min-jae said. "There's a structural problem with the back door frame that nobody has addressed." Nia looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, not far from one. "How do you even know about the back door frame?" "Malcolm mentioned it." He paused. "We talked in the supply closet." "You talked to Malcolm." She said it slowly, not a question, more like she was placing the fact in the correct context. "Twice." She looked at the table. "What did you talk about?" "Shelf anchors," Min-jae said. "And other things." He left it there. She nodded. "Once," slowly. "He's a good man." "I know," Min-jae said. "I could tell that the first time." She looked at him. "The first time?" He paused. "I saw you together once, before any of this." He held her gaze. "Outside the bookstore in Gangnam. From the car." He watched her face process this. "That's when I started paying attention." Her expression was complicated, and he didn't try to read it completely. There was something in there that was anger, old anger, that had never quite finished being anger, and something that was grief. The specific grief of a woman who had needed to be seen for years, and something else beneath both of those that he couldn't name and didn't try to. "You saw me laughing," she said. "Yes." "And you didn't recognize it." "No," he said. "I didn't. Not until it was you laughing with someone else that I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard it." He held her gaze. "That's the part I'm not proud of." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the conference room, the city went on. Traffic and wind and the particular compressed sound of 14 floors of city above the street. "I laughed with you," she said finally. "In the beginning. We laughed a lot." "We did?" "You used to do this thing at dinner when you thought you'd said something impressive. This very slight—" She paused. "You'd tilt your head, like you were waiting for a reaction but trying to look like you weren't waiting." He hadn't known he did that. "I loved that," she said. "I loved that you tried to pretend you didn't care what I thought when it was completely obvious you did." She looked at her hands. "You stopped doing it somewhere. I noticed when it stopped." She paused. "I never told you." "When did it stop?" She thought. "Third year. Around the time you took on the Busan expansion." She looked up. "You got harder. Not meaner. Just denser. Like there was less surface." She paused. "I kept waiting for the Busan pressure to pass and for you to come back to the surface." Another pause. "It didn't pass." He absorbed this. "I didn't know you were waiting." "I know you didn't." No accusation, just fact. They sat with it. Two people in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Seocho district, with signed paperwork on the table between them and 6 years of marriage behind them and no clean language for what came next. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it." "Danny, did he actually tell you your pronunciation was terrible, or is that the version you're telling people?" He looked at her. Something happened in his chest. Not pain exactly. Something more complicated. "Both," he said. "He told me, and I told everyone." And there it was. Not the big laugh, not the bookstore awning laugh. Small. Real. A sound that arrived before she could decide whether to let it. The specific, unguarded warmth of someone who had loved a person for years and whose body remembered that before anything else. It lasted 2 seconds. She pressed her lips together after, but it had been there. They walked out of the building separately, as was appropriate, attorneys alongside each of them, and on the sidewalk in front of the building, the four of them concluded the professional exchange, and the two attorneys departed in opposite directions. Min-jae and Nia stood on the sidewalk. November in Seoul had settled into itself by now. Not the tentative early cold, but the real cold, the kind that came in under your collar and stayed. The sky was clear and flat and very pale, the particular winter blue of a city where the light goes horizontal by 3 in the afternoon. "My car is that way," she said, indicating right. "Mine is the garage on this block," he said. Neither of them moved. "The foundation," she said. "I've been thinking about expanding it. Not just literacy. There are families at the center who need housing navigation, legal translation services, medical interpretation. The structure already exists. I just need. She stopped. Funding, he said. Yes, and someone who understands how to build an infrastructure without it collapsing under its own weight. She looked at him sideways. I know people who could help. I just haven't. I know those people, he said. Or I know people who are better than the people you know. He paused. I could help identify who to talk to, if you want that. She considered it. Not your organization's money. Clean money. Private consulting channels. I have no operational relationship with anymore. I've been stepping back from direct management for 2 months. He paused. Park Jun runs most of the operational side now. He stopped. Then, because she deserved the accurate version, I've been figuring out what I'm doing instead. She looked at him. And I'm still figuring. He held her gaze, but I have more time than I've had in 16 years. I'm not sure what to do with all of it yet. You could fix things, she said. Not sarcastically. Plain. I'm aware that's what I've been doing, he said. It's useful, she said. You're good at it. She paused. Don't make a face. He hadn't known he was making a face. You do the same thing about compliments as you used to do at dinner, she said. The head tilt. You still do it. He processed this information. I do? He said. You do. He looked at the sidewalk. Something that was not quite a smile and not quite grief settled on his face, and he let it stay there because managing it would have been the wrong choice, and he was getting better, slowly, at knowing the difference. She called him on a Saturday afternoon 10 days later. He was in the garage of his new apartment. He had moved out of the estate 2 weeks ago into a smaller space in Yongsan, one with no curated art and no landscaped garden, with rooms that were sized for actual living rather than impression. And he had been attempting to assemble a bookshelf from a flat-pack box, which was a different and considerably more humbling experience than repairing an existing shelf. When his phone rang, he answered it with one hand while holding a dowel in the other. There's a problem at the center, she said. His whole body shifted before she finished the sentence. What kind of problem? Not that kind of problem. A pause, and in the pause, he heard a child's voice somewhere behind her. The heating system. It broke this morning, and the maintenance company can't come until Monday. We have the winter celebration in 3 hours. He looked at the half-assembled bookshelf on his floor. He set the dowel down. What's the model number on the heating unit, he said. Min-jae. Nia. What's the model number? A pause, then movement, footsteps, the sound of a door, and she read him the number from the unit in the back room. He looked it up while she waited. He identified the probable fault in 45 seconds based on the model and age. He told her what it likely was and what he would need, and she said the building manager might have the part. And he said, have someone check, and she put him on hold and came back 90 seconds later and said yes. There was a spare igniter in the basement storage. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. He put on his jacket and drove to Mapo. He fixed the heating unit in an hour and 15 minutes. It was not clean work. The access panel was in a crawl space below the backroom floor, and he came out of it with dust on his jacket and a scrape on his forearm from the edge of the panel housing. But the system came back on at 2:47 in the afternoon, and the back room went from cold to warm by 3:15, which was when the first children began arriving for the winter celebration. He was washing his hands in the utility sink when Nia came and stood in the doorway to the utility room. She looked at his arm. You're scraped. It's shallow. There's a first aid kit in the cabinet. I know. I stocked it. He dried his hands. He had bought the kit 2 months ago when he noticed the old one was out of half its contents. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. She came into the utility room and found the kit in the cabinet and set it on the shelf beside him without asking, which was the most practical version of care, the version that didn't need acknowledgement to be real. He cleaned the scrape himself. She stood beside him in the small room and didn't go anywhere. You knew about the kit, she said. I was in here a lot in October. I noticed things. She was quiet. I noticed things, he said. I've always noticed things. He looked at the scrape, now bandaged. I was noticing the wrong rooms for a long time. She looked at him. Min-jae. Yes. I kept the apartment in Mapo, she said. You know that. I told you. Yes. But I also... She stopped. She looked at the wall and then back at him. When I went back there, after I sent the papers, I walked in and I looked around and I sat in the kitchen for an hour, and I realized I had no idea what I wanted it to feel like. She paused. I'd kept it as an exit, and I'd finally used the exit, and I was inside it, and I didn't know what to do with myself. He was listening. I called my mother in Chicago, she said. She asked me if I was sure. I told her I was. She asked me if that was the same as being certain, and She stopped. I didn't have an answer. The utility room was very small. The sound of children outside the door was growing, voices layering over each other, and somewhere Malcolm had turned on music for the celebration, something upbeat and seasonal, and the building was warming up around them both. I'm not asking you for anything, he said carefully. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not asking. I'm just going to keep coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays and fixing things that are broken, he said. Because the things need fixing, and because Danny is 2 chapters from finishing his first book, and I told him I'd be there when he finishes it. He paused. That's what I'm doing. That's all I'm doing. She looked at him for a long time. He's very proud of you, you know, she said. Danny. He tells everyone his friend fixes things. His friend, Min-jae said. His words. He looked at the doorway. Through it he could see the edge of the back room, and beyond that the main room where the celebration was assembling. Children and parents and volunteers and donated cookies and handmade paper decorations strung between the bookshelves, the sturdy ones he'd repaired in October that were now holding the weight of everything put on them without shifting. I should, he started. Yes, she said. Go. They're going to need someone to do the hot chocolate. He looked at her. You're better at standing over a large pot than anyone else here, she said. You have the right. She made a gesture indicating height and general solidity. Presence, he said. I was going to say you're tall enough not to spill it on anyone. But the corner of her mouth moved. But yes, that too. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the doorway. He stopped. Nia. Go, she said. Not unkindly. He went. The winter celebration lasted 3 hours. Min-jae stood over the large pot of hot chocolate and did not spill it on anyone. He served it in paper cups to children who arrived in front of him with both hands out, and to parents who accepted it with thanks, and to one older man who had been coming to the center for 6 months to learn computer basics, and who took his cup with great ceremony and said, in careful English, "Thank you, my friend." Min-jae said, "You're welcome, my friend." The man beamed and went to find a seat. Danny arrived at his elbow at some point during the second hour, cards in both hands, handmade, crayon, construction paper, and distributed them to specific people he had identified as deserving them. Min-jae received one. It said, in Korean that was 7-year-old Korean but recognizable, "You are good at fixing, my friend." There was a drawing of what appeared to be a shelf with a small figure next to it that Danny informed him was Min-jae. The figure was wearing a suit. I don't usually wear a suit, Min-jae said. Danny looked at him. You did the first time, he said, in Korean. Min-jae looked at the card for a moment. Thank you, he said. It's very accurate. Danny moved on to deliver the remaining cards. Min-jae held the card at his side and watched the room. He watched Malcolm lead a group of older children in a reading game that involved a lot of noise and what appeared to be a complicated point system that Malcolm was making up in real time based on the children's reactions. He watched the woman who had let him in on his first morning stand at the front table looking at the room with the expression of someone who had built this thing from small pieces over years and had not stopped being glad it existed. He watched Nia. She moved through the room the way she always moved through this room, like she belonged in it completely, like it was one of the few places on earth where she did not have to account for herself. She crouched down to a child's height without thinking about it. She remembered names. She put her hand briefly on the back of a mother who looked overwhelmed, just a moment of contact, unremarkable to everyone except the mother, whose shoulders came down an inch. She did not look at him often. When she did, she didn't look away quickly. At 6 o'clock, the celebration wound down. Children were collected by parents. Tables were folded. The large pot was washed. Min-jae helped stack chairs because the chairs needed stacking, and he was there. By 6:30, most people had gone. Malcolm stayed to lock up, as he usually did. A few volunteers finished wiping down surfaces. Min-jae put on his jacket. He picked up the card from Danny, which he had set on a shelf while he worked, and put it in his jacket pocket. He was near the front door when Nia came out of the back room with her coat and her tote bag. They walked out together without deciding to, the way people who have shared space long enough can move in the same direction without negotiation. It was cold. The kind of clean, windless cold that settled in Seoul in December and made the air feel thin and very clear. The streetlights were on. From somewhere nearby came the smell of someone's cooking, something warm and specific that neither of them commented on. They stood on the front steps. Nia reached into her bag. She was looking for her phone, he thought, or her keys, but what she pulled out was not that. It was a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases, folded and refolded enough times that the paper had gone soft. She held it in both hands without opening it. He looked at it. "The last letter," she said. "The one from the box." She looked at the paper. "I wrote it 6 months ago. I sent you the papers 3 months after that." She paused. "I took the letter back when I took the box off the shelf." "You took the box," he said. "I took it the morning the courier picked up the papers." She still wasn't looking at him. "I didn't want to leave it." She paused. "Which was probably... I didn't think too hard about what it meant." He looked at her hands on the folded paper. "I said in the letter that I loved you the way you love a place you used to live," she said, "fully and from a distance." "Yes. I think that was true when I wrote it." She looked at the paper. "I'm not sure it's still exactly true." The street was quiet around them. Down the block, a car went past. Somewhere above, a window lit up. She held the letter out toward him. He looked at it. He looked at her face. He took it. He held it in both hands and did not open it, the way she had held it, and she watched him hold it. "I'm not making promises," she said. Her voice was steady and honest and completely itself. "I can't do that yet. Maybe not for a long time. I know. I need it to be real. Whatever comes next. I can't go back to what it was." "That's not what I want either," he said. "I don't want what it was. I want what it should have been." She looked at him. "I'm learning the difference," he said, "between having someone and being present with them, between protection and presence." He held her gaze. "I'm still learning. I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. I want you to know I know that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out, not reaching for his hand, not a deliberate gesture, just the natural movement of someone whose body remembered a direction before her mind confirmed it, and she put her hand briefly against his arm. Just for a moment. The pressure of a hand through a jacket, the smallest possible version of contact. He did not move. He let it be what it was. She pulled her hand back. "I'm going home," she said. "Okay." "Tuesday?" she said. "Danny finishes his book Tuesday. You said you'd be there." "I'll be there." She went down the steps. At the bottom, she turned and looked at him once, the way you look at something you are not ready to name yet. And then she walked toward the bus stop, her coat dark against the lit street, her breath visible in the cold air, and gone. He stood on the steps of the literacy center in Mapo district and watched her go. He did not call after her. He did not follow. He let the distance between them be what it was. Not an ending and not yet a beginning, but the particular and honest space between two people who had broken something real and were deciding, separately and together, whether the material was worth working with. He put the letter in his pocket next to Danny's card. He stood in the cold for another minute, looking at the street, at the ordinary ongoing city, at the lit windows above the shops, and the people moving through the night with their particular purposes, and the sky above it all, dark and clear and enormous, in the way skies are over cities at night, making the lights below look both significant and very small. He went down the steps. He walked to his car, which was parked half a block away, and he got in and sat behind the wheel without starting it immediately. He took the letter out of his pocket and held it, folded, in both hands, the way she had held it. He thought about the recipe card and its notation, "Add ginger if he's had a hard week." He thought about a 7-year-old boy who had decided that Min-jae's primary purpose was to help him learn Korean and had not entertained any alternative theory. He thought about a shelf that was now holding the weight put on it without shifting. He thought about a cedar box and a woman who had kept an apartment in Mapo for 4 years with her name on the lease, not as defeat, not as preparation for failure, but as the smallest insistence on a life that was entirely her own, which was, he understood now, the most honest thing either of them had ever done in their marriage. He had been afraid of losing her. He should have been paying attention. He started the car. The street unfolded in front of him, lit and ordinary and going somewhere. And he pulled out and drove through Mapo district toward Yongsan, toward the apartment where a half-assembled bookshelf waited on the floor and where he would finish it tonight because it needed doing and because he was the one who was there. He did not have everything. He had Tuesday. For a man who had spent 16 years building things that were supposed to last forever and had gotten very good at it and had still lost the most important thing through sheer inattention, Tuesday was not a small amount. It was in fact exactly where everything real had always started. He drove home through the lit and living city, and the letter stayed in his pocket, and the card from a 7-year-old who drew him in a suit stayed beside it, and the cold pressed against the windows and fell behind as he moved, and Seoul went on around him the way cities do, indifferent, constant, and full, despite everything, of people finding their way toward the specific and ordinary light of someone who was finally, after everything,